I'm going to hand over to Professor Paul Corrigan to try and get us back on track for the afternoon, because I know we're going to have challenges later on the motorways. So, Professor Paul Corrigan.
Okay. I've got two bits of introduction to do. One is to introduce how we're going to make the workshop work, and then to introduce a part of the workshop as outcome-based commissioning. Last year, we came and did a workshop up here around outcome-based commissioning. And it seemed very odd to end up at the point when actually the health service was going to be doing something different with provision. In other words, just to concentrate on commissioning. So what we're doing today is talking both about commissioners and about providers doing integrated care. However, the purpose of this this workshop is to say these are two separate things that need to come together at various stages, but within the current architecture of the National Health Service, these are two separate things, and they both need to address integrated care and outcomes in slightly different ways. So I'm talking about outcome-based commissioning. We've got then an example from a pioneer, and then Alan Nye is coming to talk about outcome-based provision. And whilst a lot of the language, a lot of the way in which we talk about things are the same, I think it's wrong to say that providers and commissioners face exactly the same challenges in this. How you get this thing going depends on whether you're a part of the provider or purchaser split. You then work together, but in a sense, people who are board members, lay members of a CCG or board members of a provider, actually face different issues in getting this going. So the nature of the workshop today has got a series, 3 inputs and some discussion. And then at 3:45, what we're going to do is develop a thing called a goldfish bowl. And the goldfish bowl means that, first of all, we have half an hour with these 3 tables organised with just commissioners on, talking about the main 3 things they need to think about in doing outcome-based commissioning. Outside the goldfish bowl, there's the providers watching. After half an hour, you switch that and have the providers saying, OK, if people are going to commission this stuff, what are the 3 things we need to do as providers? Now, obviously, the goldfish bowl demonstrates that these things are being done differently, but in sight of each other and in relationship to each other. These are not being done, these shouldn't be done in the National Health Service, in entirely different worlds. But they need to be done separately, but in the gaze of each other. So the aim of the goldfish bowl is to literally try and replicate, as we start to tussle with these things, how we should be doing it, which is separately but relatedly. Because there are different interests, but an outcome which has to be worked with together. And then we'll finish with just saying, how did that work? And what comes out of it. So that's the aim of the afternoon. And just put your hands up if you're a provider. Commissioner? Great. So we've got enough to do that. Very good. So people know what we're going to do. You're in the right place. There's no GGs running around. So you're stuck with this if you're in Adoc Park at the moment. Right, so I'm now going to move on to what is, having said we're going to be dealing through the afternoon with the different parts of this, I'm now going to move on to the development of outcome-based commissioning. So in a sense, the next 45 minutes or so is talking around the commissioning part of this, although as you'll see, there's aspects of provision in it. And these slides will go up, will be emailed to everybody at the end of the day. Is that right? Yeah. And I suppose the one thing I wanted to say, start off with this, is that those of us who have been around the NHS for a while are wary of fashions and are wary of things that we put a lot of time and effort into, and then it doesn't matter anymore and you turn on to something else. And I think I probably want to say integrated care is beyond a fashion. Integrated care is not something that is just going to disappear in a few years' time. It may be reframed in a slightly more integrated way, but the movement from fragmented care to integrated care is happening in almost every country in the world in the relationship of health and social care. Every country in the world, whether it's a developing nation, an emerging nation, or a nation with a developed health service, is confronting the fact that it has developed a health service which is essentially fragmented, and it now needs to link those things together. And the reason for that is because the nature of disease, the business that we work with, has changed and is changing. And the nature of disease that's changing is that we are now confronting healthcare systems in India, in Australia, in America, and in this country are confronting a different set of diseases, which are primarily now chronic diseases and around the long term. And having built a healthcare system which works quite well with acute diseases, we now find that actually the nature of our business, the nature of healthcare, the nature of the disease has changed, and therefore the nature of our system needs to change. And this is an incredibly large change that is happening everywhere. And I can't, who knows, in 20 or 30 years' time, all sorts of medicines and drugs may have changed all sorts of things, but the changing the nature of fragmentation into coordination, into integration, is something that I think we'll be wrestling with for some time to come. And I'll talk a bit about that, but I think the other thing to say at a general level is that people have been trying to do this in this country and other places for some time, and it is very hard. I think it's really quite important when we're trying to do something to be honest about the nature of the difficulties involved. The thing about the fragmentation that we're confronting is that people are quite passionate about it. They don't come to work passionate about, I'd like to fragment a health service. They come to work and they're really interested in cardiology. Or they're really interested. I was doing some work in West London the other day, and a group of district nurses were really pleased because they just set up a special tissue service. Really good idea. They specialised into a tissue service, but then they created a piece of fragmentation by that very thing, because the tissue service then needs to relate to the other district nurses. So the dynamics of medicine has created passionate fragmentation. And it's not a bad thing. You know, when I'm very ill, I want to be treated by someone who believes and has just done that particular treatment. I don't want to be treated by a generalist. Specialism has saved lots of lives and relieved lots of pain and distress. It's really important. We're not, in talking about integration, saying that everyone's going to do everything. Because actually specialism is very important. In every other industry and in the health service, the division of labour is a really good thing. And in the health service, it's saved lots of lives. But in every other industry, it's organised to provide a stream of customer service, which it isn't in the health service. So we're not saying that integration does away with specialisation, but it organises specialisation in a different way. And again, to come back to the point of this little bit, is that we need to realise most of the people that are working in the health service have a passion for a specialisation of some kind or another. GPs are passionate about their generalists as a specialisation. They often talk about the fact that GPs are specialists in generalisation. And people actually think about that specialism. So when you go into a people and you say, right, we're now going to construct a patient pathway, most of the people who are providing healthcare at the moment lose something in that discussion. I think the patient gains an enormous amount, but the workforce loses something in that discussion. And that is one of the reasons this is very hard. If I was working almost anywhere in the health service, I would have worked very hard at getting to this level of specialisation. And then you come along and say, we're now going to do all this differently. Are we? Right? I don't move away from the fact that I think this is the tide of history in the nature of health services. But if we're going to do this, we need to recognise how hard it is. Okay, let me get on with these slides. Some words about fragmentation. We often hear, and certainly those places that have been successful in constructing integration So Torbay constructed an example of Mrs. Smith. And Mrs. Smith was used millions of times, probably literally millions of times, in every presentation that everyone did about integration. And the reason for that is we've all got in our minds, whether it's one of our relatives or someone that we've been working with, the problems that fragmentation throws up in the lives and the treatment of a particular person. And so you can, if you take an 85-year-old woman with 3 comorbidities, some diabetes, some arthritis and depression, if she's living on her own and getting social care as well, it's quite likely that there will be, going through her house, 15 to 20 people in a month. And you actually probably need to be very good at an Excel spreadsheet to be able to understand all these different things that are happening to you. It's also quite interesting that almost nobody that goes through the house will notice the carpet's frayed that she falls over on at the end of that month, because nobody's looking for that frayed carpet. So the experience of fragmentation for the patient, including in all of this health and social care, is a very bewildering experience, which actually means that a lot of the care doesn't actually stick because you're waiting for the next one to come in and to do something entirely different. All the things that we hear about, people telling the same story over and over again, because you've got different sorts of... It is for the person, for that stock patient of the older person with several long-term conditions, the way we construct healthcare at the moment, health and social care at the moment, is very bad. Interestingly, this point of this slide is that I think I'm also making a case out that it's very uneconomic. And the lack of economy that comes from fragmentation is because each bit of the service is getting better and better at creating value in each bit of the service. Let me just use the example of hips and knee replacement. I have a friend who's chair of a trust in the northeast of England. He's had 2 hips and 2 knees done in 12 years. 12 years ago, when he was obviously 12 years younger, he had the first hip done and he was in hospital for 8 days. He had the knee done last year and was in overnight. That's the drop in the length of stay of hips and knees has been phenomenal in the last decade or so. And that increases the value of the health service by actually spending less resource in doing a hip or doing a knee. And I think what I'd say is almost every aspect of the health service is increasing value in their bit. However, if my friend comes home and there is no physio for 3 days, the knee locks. And all the value that's been put in flows out and disappears. And a lot of what we're doing, that is the image I have in my mind, where people come in and do something and construct a lot of value, but actually, in the end, the value disappears because nobody is actually working on how to turn all this into what in another industry we would call a value chain. And how do these things lock together? So the purpose of integration and coordination in economic terms is to lock together the various bits of improvement in value that happen in episodes, in episodic care, and to try and say these need to be part of something which adds up to a greater value at the end of that chain. And I think that's a very strong economic argument. If you look at the various bits of health and social care, so in the Northwest, it was Andy Burnham that started to make a fuss about the 15-minute home care visits. Now, I can understand if I'm running a home care service that actually a 15-minute visit is economic because you're squeezing as much value into that. But actually, for the person at the end of that, the lack of that 15 minutes being linked to anything else that's going on means that actually it's not economic. If I'm an old person, I have 6 15-minute visits in a week, that probably doesn't add up to very much because it's like a bewildering number of people coming in and out. So the economic argument behind what we're talking about today is there needs to be the episodic care creates then losing values at the loses value at the failed handover. Because lack of time is done. Organisation X comes in, does its thing, disappears. Organisation Y comes in, does its thing. Specialist X comes in. When I was working on this a couple of years ago, I went and talked to all the Royal Colleges about this. And the one that was the most surprising, as I went to talk to the Royal College of Anaesthetists. And the interesting thing about anaesthetists is that my impression was they only really ever saw people when they were out of it. Right? So what is their interaction with their patients? How do they deal with integrated care when actually what they're doing in a very specialist way is putting you out and bringing you back again? And the guy in charge of the Royal College, you don't understand us at all, he said. If my members could get hold of someone 2 weeks before they had their operation and talk to them about what they ate and what exercise they did, it would transform their anaesthetic. Because if they ate well and they did as much movement as they could, it changes the nature of the way, the amount of anaesthetic. And the secret in anaesthesia is not using more than you have to. So the Royal College of Anaesthetists wants more integrated care because it changes the nature of anaesthetic. And those of you that had operations or friends have had operations, you'll now see my missus had the bottom of her spine reconstructed. And went to the operation very successful. The moment she comes round, 2 nurses get out of bed and start walking up and down the ward. It was terrifying, but it meant that the operation succeeded much more. So all the things we think about have next to it 2 or 3 things into a value chain. And honestly, in talking to almost every aspect of health and social care, whilst people may not understand the whole chain, they get the things next door. Oh, yeah. And so in making this case to professionals, I found it not easy to make the whole case, but to talk about a value chain of the 5 things, the 2 things either side of what we do. Almost everybody gets it. So the problem of waste here is the waste of value that we're succeeding in our bits at improving, but not succeeding in bringing together. Now, why are we dealing with outcomes? Why has this become such an important issue? I used to work in the 1990s in local government in London. And I remember in the early 90s, the way in which different boroughs in London judged whether they had a good school meals service was the amount of money we spent on it. And so people really did say, I worked in Islington, our school meals are better than yours because we spend more money. That was honestly the discourse. That was, no one could conceive of another way of judging it. So the inputs of the school meals was what made a good school meal. And ours was more expensive, therefore it was better. And then basically it crept in that actually the school meal you were constructing actually may have had no nutritional value whatsoever and was an expensive way of putting a load of trash on kids' plates. And so, okay, that was an input, it didn't work, so let's look at an out. And the output was, so I'm trying to make the distinction between inputs, outputs and outcomes here. The output was, let's look at nutrition. And being Islington, you had nutritionists crawling all over the place and saying what you've got to do is actually have much more nutritional food on the plate and we'll judge the school dinner by the output. Trouble is, the kids didn't eat them because they were horrible, right? I wouldn't have ate them, right? They were boring food. And so you'd increase the output, but decrease the outcome because it hadn't got any in the child. And the thing about the outcome, which makes it different from inputs and outputs, is the outcome has to involve in some way the consumer. Otherwise, the outcome's 0 or less than it might be. So when we move from an output, which is this hip works pretty well, I can do this with it, to an outcome, the outcome is I can walk down the shops, the outcome is I'm going to see my daughter, the outcome is something which involves my life. And the reason the shift between outputs and outcomes is really hard for professionals is they lose control when it comes to an outcome, whereas they don't with an input and an output. So this isn't simply jollily going along from inputs to outcomes. Once you go from outputs to outcomes, in talking again with orthopaedic surgeons, they'll say, well, I've done a brilliant operation there. The fact that the lady can't walk down the shops is nothing to do with me, because my bits worked. And that's the problem with the lack of a value chain. And then they'll say, but this woman lives up a hill. That's just not fair. Well, unfortunately, people live on hills. Right? That's sort of where people live. So, so the unfairness of moving to outcomes and doing this work on outcome-based commissioning, you can see working with professionals, it is really shocking for people that they might be judged by something which they're not in control of. But actually, that's the only way of moving to something which passionately relates to the public rather than something. So if I had a good hip replacement, which everyone in the health service is a good hip replacement, but I can't walk, that can't be a good hip replacement. That just can't be a good hip replacement. Medically, it was wonderful. No. In my life, it's not worked. So the reason that a lot of people are now, including the government, are going on about outcomes is these are really quite, at a political level, we need to prove to the public that all of this stuff has some importance to them. And simply doing operations which actually don't improve people's lives is a problem about proving this matters to them. Their experience, their experience is also, I went into hospital, they treat me very well, but it doesn't seem to have worked, is a problem, right? It's a puzzle, right? So the doctors say this is what patient says, I did very well, but actually I still can't walk. So how can we judge that a success as an experience? So the interesting thing about when talking to the public, I did some work over a year ago now in Oxfordshire, where there was lots of old people's groups in the room because they're looking at a outcome-based contract for the frail elderly. And what is the issue that matters to the frail elderly? So what's an outcome? And it took about an hour, that's all. And they said, well, there's lots and lots of different things you do for us. You spend a lot of money on us. But actually, we think at the end of every interaction with the health service or with social care, at the end of that interaction, we'd like to be more independent than we were at the beginning. Actually, stunningly straightforward and actually as a piece of social good, almost unanswerable. Actually, the reverse is a lot of what happens at the moment. If you go into hospital at all and you're of a certain age, you're almost certain to come out slightly more demented than when you went in, because people move you around in the middle of the night. You know, if that happens to me, I get a bit odd, right? If I wake up in a different bed that I went into, in a different ward. So hospitals are very complex places. The more time that old people spend in them, the more likely they are that dementia is going to hit them harder. So whilst we could be spending £30,000 on getting somebody more demented, that's obviously crazy, right? But actually that's what we're doing, because actually we don't look at that notion of independence as the thing that we're moving towards. And as an outcome, for the public to say this is what we'd like, I think we need pretty good reasons to go back to them and say, no, you're not going to have it. We're going to make you more dependent. We're going to spend £30,000 on you, making you more dependent. That's no, it isn't. It can't be the purpose of what we're doing. So the reason for, one of the interesting things in talking to patient organisations around this is that they do have some very clear ideas about outcomes, but the thing to say is they're very, very difficult then to implement because we're doing things in a different way. So again, the point to make about these slides is that, you know, you can run through a set of slides which says these are the things. We're going to have an outcome-based contract. We're going to drive towards independence. But the change that brings in what we're doing is phenomenal. This is not a little thing again, I suppose I want to say. Wrong way. And we're talking about, I'm talking about commissioning here. And the problem is, a lot of the actual experience of commissioning, I used to be the director of commissioning for NHS London, and I had 31 PCTs, and I don't know, probably about £10 billion went through these organisations. And actually the amount of money that was actually commissioned, where people sat down and thought, this is this is not just an outcome we want, but this is something we want to buy, was a very small percentage of that money. Most of the money was allocated on what had done last year, plus or minus a few percent. And so the experience, and the reason, again, I'm afraid this is quite a radical thing, is that actually sitting down and thinking, what are we doing for the frail elderly? What are we doing around musculoskeletal services? Is not, and how then do we use our resources to treat this differently, is not something that's, we may have had PCTs and CCGs for some time, but this is not the way in which they've been operating. So asking these questions and starting to ask them in a different way is a very different thing. So much of the activity has been called commission has been the allocation of money. Some are contracts for volumes of inputs, and so I will buy 3,000 hip replacements from you, and I'll check that you've done 2,997, and I might even check whether they work. But actually the amount of sequins that actually are used for quality rather than just actually balancing the books at the end of the year. Again, I'd be surprised if it's 20% across the country. So very, very few contracts have gone beyond fragmented inputs, and very few relate to population or segment of the population and the needs of that segment of the population. So when you start talking about outcome-based commissioning, it is a very different experience, both for you as CCGs, but also then responding to that commission for providers that has been there, than has been there before. And this is really the things that over the last few years that I think you accrue, that if you're going to do outcome-based commissioning, you need to be doing mainly these things all at once. And also, I think the point to make, because there are certainly local authorities on the list to come here, that in talking about commissioners here, I think we're talking about at least 4 different sorts of commissioners, all of which need to be involved. The CCG needs to be involved. The local authority's social care commissioner needs to be involved. NHS England as a GP commissioner needs to be involved, and you'll have picked up in the last few weeks that Simon Stevens is looking to really, and I think this is incredibly good news, really transfer some of the commissioning from NHS England to CCGs. And so in every other discussion I've had about this in the last 18 months ago, that seems to be the first big block, and at least there's some discussion about it now. And the fourth set of commissioners, and this is in public health, which are now with local authorities. Many of the things that you'll be doing need to have a preventative bit that needs to be a part of this process. So getting 4 groups of commissioners together, if you're going to really do an integrated care pathway, there will be something preventative in it, there will be GPs involved in it, there will be health commissioning involved in it, and there'll be social care commissioning involved in it. And all of them need to recognise their interest in this. I've found in the real world of real discussions around outcome-based commissioning, local authorities and CCGs have a lot in common in that about 1 or 2% of their population consume between 1/3 and 40% of their resources. It's a similar sort of group. And the overlap between those groups, not 100%, but the overlap's really quite high. In local authorities, much more money is spent on people with learning disabilities than in the health service. But actually, by and large, the old people issue is a fairly strong issue about there being an overlap. So you have to get, and local authorities, let's not forget, have had an awful experience of cuts in their budgets in the last few years. So they have to look forward to doing something different. So local authorities, at least local authorities and CCGs, need to start confronting this together. And these are the 5 sets of issues, I think, that are then necessary. And this may seem an odd thing to say, that you need persistent and brave commissioners. But actually, the point I've made up to now is this is really something different. And it is, it's not something to start on lightly, because a whole range of people will start to say, this is really going to change the way in which my organisation works. And we'll see in a minute that, the moment a major provider starts to think this through. So in Oxfordshire, the Oxford Radcliffe was in these meetings with older people, and they started to say, does that mean we'd only get paid if a older person left the hospital more independent when they came in? And the older people said, yes, of course. And then they said, you mean you get paid at the moment when you make us more dependent? Yes. No, you don't. Yes, no. So actually the mismatch between the expectation and the reality is that that's a fundamental change for that organisation, which it couldn't do within 5 years, because it needs to change almost every aspect of the organisation. So the reason for persistent and brave commissioners is you really need to push this thing forward. And one of the places where this has just begun in Bedfordshire, and Alan and I, we're hearing later on, is working in Bedfordshire as a part of the consortium that's providing musculoskeletal services there, is that in July 2012, the head of the CCG in Bedfordshire got all 5 hospitals together and said, look, instead of having 5 contracts with you and 20 with physios, we're going to have a single contract. And I wanted to get you to think about that, because this is really what we want to do. And the hospitals got together that evening and wrote to him and said, we're not going to play. We're just not going to do it. And so there you had someone who was chair of an organisation that at that time didn't exist. CCGs didn't exist, being confronted with all of his hospitals saying, we're not going to do any hips and knees for you. And that's what I mean about brave, right? So you don't get any sleep. You wake up the next morning, he writes a letter back, and he says, I've been a GP here for 25 years. I'd really like to congratulate you. It's the first time you've done anything together. In writing that letter saying no, you've crossed the Rubicon of doing something together. Well done. Get on with it. And actually, I think the reason for that story is this is tough, right? I've got no doubt about it's the right thing to do, but I don't think it's the thing to do lightly. And what's interesting is that, one of the sad things I did about a year ago is look at all of the commissioning intentions of all of the CCGs, and over 170 say they want to do integrated care of 211. It is a major issue. But actually, the moment you go down that road and say, right, we're going to look at the frail elderly, we're not going to look at diabetes, we're going to look at the frail elderly, it upsets the way in which everything is done at the moment. So I think, at the very least, this needs... one of the reasons we're going on talking about Torbay and Mrs. Smith is that once you've exemplified this around a particular patient, you feel you can't let her down in the same way. And one of the ways in which people use this narrative is in order to give you some sort of some continued rationale for keep on doing it. Secondly, and at the end of these slides, again, you'll get them afterwards, is a series of URLs about how to follow these things up. One of the organisations I work with is an organisation called COBIC, which means that's all right. Which means I thought someone was whistling at me. I know, I've been looking forward to that all my life. A COBIC is a capitated outcome-based incentivised contract. It's a form of contract that's been constructed by a group of GPs in the East Midlands to actually provide a contractual form which you can put outcomes in. And they're working with about 20 different CCGs trying to work out. This isn't the only way of doing it. There is an organisation that's developing alliance contracts as well. But one thing you do need is a different contractual form to do this through. The national contract has been constructed around inputs and around episodes. And therefore, the contractual form that we have, and NHS England, from the very beginning, has said around COBICs and alliance, this is really very interesting. We're not going to say everyone has to do this, but we're not going to stop it either. So actually, there are contractual forms being worked out, and that have one's come to fruition in Bedfordshire. And the idea is that you try and construct, okay, if we are looking at the outcome, if we are looking at greater independence, how then do we construct a contract around that? How do you say, at the moment, Mrs. Smith, with those 3 long-term conditions, has about £40,000-50,000 on health and social care paid out in probably about 15 different contracts. How do you bring all that together into one? This is not, again, a straightforward thing, but there are organisations that have been doing it. And one of the ways in which I'd really stress on this, having done a little bit of this myself, is that the way in which we tend to deal with contracts in the public sector is truly awful compared to the way in which the private sector deal with it. We actually do not allow any sort of discussion between the contractor and the contractee, whereas actually in the private sector there's nothing but discussion that goes on. And the organisation of competitive dialogue is where you say to providers, and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, that are trying to organise a contract around old people's services, have actually engaged in a whole range of competitive dialogue that I've been a bit involved in, where the CCG turns up and says, look, we're trying to do this. We don't really understand it. We've got a sneaking suspicion that you over there as providers actually know more about this than we do. It's just you're not doing it in the same way. Talk to us about it. And so you have the thing as a piece of competitive discussion, and it's quite difficult for. The first time I did this with 25 providers around cardiology in London, we'd be interested in a dialogue. No one says a word because they just haven't been used to dealing with it that way, because they've been used to being very quiet and not giving away any of their good ideas. But actually, the dialogue seems to be an essential part of this process, because otherwise we don't know as commissioners what it is that is at all possible. And certainly when Ford Europe is constructing the need for a new engine, it spends a lot of time in dialogue with everyone that's making those engines, rather than simply saying, we'll make it up as a buyer. You also need new pricing mechanisms. At the moment, we know that we've got pricing mechanisms that are essentially around individual bits of inputs that are fragmented. And the interesting thing is payment by results has been seen as immutable, but actually both NHS England and Monitor say we'd be interested in doing this a different way. And that there are probably about 30 places around the country trying to develop this year of care tariff. What would it look like if we added up everything that Mrs. Smith... And this, again, having done this a little bit in Mid-Essex, it ends up being something really quite empirical. What was spent last year on Mrs. Smith? Now, let's try and add it all together, right? And you get it 85% right. And so when you let the contract, however you let that contract, there needs to be some movement in that, because you might be 15% wrong. And so you need to have some sort of gain share in letting that contract. There's the community services in Mid-Essex is providing a service at the moment for about 1,200 people who were very frail last year. They roughly worked out what the cost was last year. And they'll roughly be developing a service within that cost, but it will take 2 or 3 years to work out. So again, the dialogue has to be pretty good in that discussion. So I think we are beginning to see, compared to 2 years ago, a sort of breaking of the logjam around PBRs, and there's a lot of work going on that. This is, I think, really important for the future of the health service, and I suppose the thing to say is the next thing that makes integration difficult is that integration isn't just bringing together all of the existing services and stapling them together and saying that's integration. Actually, there needs to be a recognition that for nearly everyone we're talking about, the patient has a much greater capacity to play a role in their healthcare than the health service has constructed for them in the past. And self-management is something, if you've got a long-term condition, the secret's in the name, you have it for a long time. And if you have it for a long time, you learn quite a lot about the interaction of that condition and your body. And you learn what to do about it in a way in which no medical profession can, because they're dealing with it generally. You live with that for 5,800 waking hours a year. And you learn quite a bit about that. If you work with the health service, if the health service works with you for 10 hours in that year, that's quite a lot compared to what will happen to most people. If we improve the productivity of those 10 hours by 20%, great. If we improve the productivity of the 5,800 hours by 5%, we've solved the problem. So at the moment, people self-manage, but they do it pretty badly. What they don't do is do it with the expertise that if we invested in their self-management, we could change. So again, with diabetes, there are these two wonderful courses, Daphne and Desmond. I always get them around the wrong way, one for diabetes 1, one for diabetes 2. And they're quite extensive courses about how you work with your diabetes, the expert patient program. But there's a lot of bits and pieces around the health service now that are dealing with ways about how you invest in self-management. If we have 15 million people with long-term conditions, if the crisis for the future of the health service is many more people with many more long-term conditions, we need to make sure that they have the capacity to invest. We have the capacity to invest in their capacity to better self-manage. Honestly, if you one of the other obvious things is the amount of pills that are prescribed and not taken is phenomenal, because no one's bothering to explain exactly what's going on with these pills. Take these antibiotics, halfway through, I feel better now, you stop taking them. Because because an extra minute explaining that means the value of the pills increases enormously. So again, these are just investments in, and the word that we use about medicine, prescriptions and medicines is compliance. People don't comply with their drug regime. Compliance is sort of like an army word. Imagine Tesco's saying customers don't comply. No one would go, right? So the way in which we think about patients is not ones where we're doing that investment. And the interesting thing about other industries, just to mention Tesco's. So when we go into Tesco's, compared to 30 years ago, when we went to buy groceries, I do most of the work now. I go in there, I do all the selection, I now do all of the barcoding, and I like it. I feel in charge of it. There's no one between me and the cheese, as there used to be. There's no one, I'm in charge of this process. Now, banking, I now do all my banking on the internet. The bank used to think it was their money, right? And all of this, but that means I personally sacked several bank tellers, several checkout people, because I'm now adding that value. Now, the health analogy is not a difficult one here. It's just that we're not very good at making it happen. People are doing all of this work with their own healthcare, but we have to. So a part of this process must be, if it's going to really hit the nail, has got to be increasing self-management. And again, I used the word value early on. That value improvement comes about from improving the value that patients can put in. Again, even something more, you've had a heart attack, right? The thing that matters in that period after then is what you do, how you can be persuaded to act differently in your life. Medicine's terrifically important, but actually how do you interact? The other thing about if you've had a heart attack is if you are isolated, you're more likely to die. If you've got friends, relatives, you're more likely to live. So there are things entirely outside of medicine that matters a lot to these survival rates, and that has to be a part of this process. And this is once all of this starts to happen, the fifth thing is you need to recognise there will be a new forms of organisation of providers. And it's nobody's fault that current providers have been organised, very well organised, to provide fragmented episodic care. GPs have been organised in an entirely different way since 1948 from the way in which hospitals have been organised. Hospitals have been organised in a very specific set of way, and so to simply say, OK, throw all that up in the air and now provide integrated care, it's an incredibly big change. And one of the things that has to happen, and these are just some of the things that, the thing that I've experienced most going around talking about integrated care and outcome-based care is people will say, this is a very good idea, but you're not really going to do it, are you? Because if you really do it, it'll change everything. And And that's, you know, so the debate is, let's have a discussion around integration. Everyone says, a cracking idea, but let's not do it, eh? Because if we do it, it will change lots of things. And the change in the nature of provision, there you are, you're the director of finance of an organisation, and you've just about got things going around fragmented care, and someone's going to say, we're going to throw all that up in the air, it's going to have a year of care tax. I don't know, right? So, and one of the things that makes this happen is that everybody who's providing needs to be as responsible for the handover as they are for their bit of provision. And at the moment, people do a really good job doing their bit of provision, but have no concern whatsoever for the handover. So no concern, back to my economic argument, that value disappears. I've done a good job, but then value disappears. And it's not my responsibility, but actually the value's disappeared from your good job. So integration becomes everybody's business as the only way of constructing this value. And we developed, again, at URL, this idea of an accountable lead provider, where somebody is responsible for the accountability of all of these different organisations doing it. And in other industries, it's a word that doesn't make much sense in the health service, but this is what logistics does. Logistics organises all these different things. And, you know, when we go and have a cup of tea, we didn't actually go out and buy a tea plantation. We didn't buy a shipping company. We didn't buy someone to put it in the tea bags. You know, all of that is done for us and that's done by a logistics organisation. And the rest of and people say health service is complex. Well, you try and get a cup of tea, right, if a logistics firm isn't organising that for you, and you can't do it. So all of these things are quite complex, but we've now got used to the fact there are organisations integrating all of these different... There's several different industries involved in getting us that cup of tea. Honestly, there are enormous different industries, and we just take it for granted. Now, with the health service, nobody takes that for granted, and there's probably only 2 or 3 industries involved. So really, this is the point I've just been making. NHS integrators will become integrated with their own and other services. The problem is, for a lot of our organisations, it's not just integrating between different organisations, but within them. The organisations are pretty separate within them. So if I want to develop a service for older people in a medium-sized hospital, getting the diabetologists and the blood pressure and all of those people to work together is probably harder than getting a single organisation to work with another organisation, because I'm an expert in diabetes. You know, that's what I do. So constructing internal and external integration is something which probably everyone needs to play a role at. Sometimes this will be the largest organisation will be the accountable lead provider. Sometimes it won't be. Sometimes it'll be an organisation that's good at integration. And so, you know, one of the places, there's a mental health trust in London called Central and North West London Mental Health Trust. The interesting thing about the name is it no longer describes what they do, because they provide mental health services outside of London, and they provide non-mental health services outside of London, because they provide community health services. So they've got used to reaching beyond the title into doing other things. And I think we've all been used to sticking to our title. Again, for the non-exec directors here, you have a role to stick to the nature of your organisation. I think one of the things I'm saying here is the way in which you're going to safeguard the future of your organisation is by going beyond that organisation to being yourself an integrator. And so the mental health organisations have been used to doing inside hospital integration with outside hospital integration as a part of mental health services. It's what they've been doing for X years. So they might have some messages for doing that for physical provision. So all of this is constructing saying that the clinical issues are important, but the integration between those clinical issues are as important and need as much skill. And just again, you'll get these. There is some references and URLs there, and there's also the local authority side of the fence are really interested in this, and the Local Government Association have put a lot of effort into constructing a knowledge hub and various aspects of integration. Sorry, there was a lot there. Any questions? Yeah.
I'm from a community side of things, and you talked very eloquently there. It was terrific, and I agreed with just about everything you said. But I'm sat here thinking about the barriers of that integrated care. And when I go out with my district nurse, and she's dealing with the health of that patient, and I can see that Mrs. Jones has had social care in the morning to get her up. She's got social care coming in the evening, and there's a file in the corner that actually the health person doesn't look at, so I read it. And I'm sat there thinking, now, as you say, let's throw some common sense at this. There should be this group of people around this patient. Now, what are the barriers to that? And I'm thinking, okay, that's commissioned by local authority. They're in dire straits financially. Those people, it would make sense for her to have it all delivered by the same group of people. But those people that are coming in there, I imagine, are not as well played as the NHS and are on very different terms and conditions. And that input is also, if I'm right, means tested. So immediately I can see there's a lot of heads come around the table and go, oh, this is too this is in this too difficult to handle box. But that is a huge barrier to overcome. And I'd love to hear if you've heard of anyone who has overcome that and how they do it.
Have you got an answer to that?
I'm Carol Baker Longshore. I come from Trafford. I'm actually employed by Pen and Care. And yes, I have got an answer, because children's services in Trafford have been integrated for 7 years under the Section 735 partnership arrangement. Okay, we haven't achieved it yet with the adult service. We're on our way towards that. There's been loads of work done over the last 5 years or so in relation to that. But in terms of children's services, we went through all those were all the kind of barriers that we thought we were facing. But through, I think, a spirit of goodwill and through the vision being very clear for those people who were leading the different organisations, so that they got the assurance from the government's perspective that with the outcome is going to actually make a better impact on the quality of life for children and young people and make them safer in the long run by having an integrated provider model for a vehicle for delivery. Those barriers soon diminish, because I think you need your strategic players to actually have the buy-in, the people who are the commissioners to feel safe that the way that it's going to be delivered is going to be safe, and then the professional stuff of district nurses or clinicians, whether they're psychologists, school nurses, teachers, health visits, doctors, it doesn't matter, but you work through that because there'll be a will, and the will comes from the fact you want better outcomes for the patients. So I think there's something about sticking at it.
Excuse me for being sceptical.
No.
Who turns out to be the lead for that? Obviously it needs a lead.
It does. And the answer in different parts of the country is a different answer, right? It's the person who wants it most passionately ends up being the leader. And sometimes it's a provider who will go to the commissioners and say, this is bonkers. Let me just walk through how you're wasting money. We'll go to all the commissioners and let me help you provide a beginning of how you might do that differently, a single commission, and start to do that. Sometimes it's the commissioners who will look at the provider and think, this is crazy. Sometimes, and I think often, it starts with a patient group or an organisation like Age UK that says, my God, this is crazy. Or a carers organisation. But where the point is, somebody in a leadership position needs to say about it, when you're down here, the barriers look insuperable. Right? Actually, up here, they are to play for. Not easy, but they're to play for. And the one thing I sort of mentioned in passing, but I think, having been involved in a lot of change over the years, actually having a story is really important. People talk about we need a compelling case for change. A lot of my work is people come to me and say, we've got a compelling case for change, but no one agrees with it. And I say, well, it's not very compelling then, is it really? If it's compelling, they would sort of agree with it. And the compelling case for change is often around Mrs. Smith. If you go through, her life now and you go through what it might be and say, okay, we're just not up to this, are we? We're just not up to improving this person's life. And so there's a bit of shame. But then you need, just buzzing through what I said here, that they're doing this in Torbay, they're doing this in Mid-Essex, they're doing this, they're doing bits and pieces of this. I think on one slide says something of this is happening everywhere, well, in lots of places. Yeah.
And the other half of Carol.
Ah, how nice.
And I'm really interested in your point about the district nurse is there, the carer is there that we're paying from social care with very stretched budgets, etc. And the file, which is around coordinated care, is sat in a dusty cupboard or unused and not helping the situation. I actually think there are benefits to social care, and I think most people think there aren't, and that we're just after health money, but we're not. We are really short of money in social care. I don't know how many people are here from social care, but it is very, very difficult. And what Carol and I have been thinking about and looking at is actually could we get more outcomes from the use of those carers by enabling the district nurse to support how they work, and that's the key, isn't it, I think. I'm really, really a big believer in joint and shared outcomes. I think we're all in a difficult place, and if we can agree how we can both improve our outcomes for that person that's receiving the care, it's a win-win for everybody, and I think that's the basis. I actually really believe this is down to committed individuals who've got a will to make it work in each of the locations, and it'll be different everywhere because we're all different services.
And we are in one of these really odd situations with this, where what is in the interests of social care is in the interest of the health budget and is in the interest of the old lady. Right? So going into residential home is not what the old lady wants unless they're very unusual. Going to hospital for emergencies is not what they want. What they want is more independence. What we want is them not to go into hospital for emergency. What we want. So it's quite unusual. All the sort of bits of change I've done in my life, it's quite unusual to find something where nearly all the patient groups and the leadership of both the organisations say what we're doing at the moment is both expensive and not working. How do we change that?
I just wanted to add one more bit into the mix. I just wanted to add one more bit into the mix. If we're going to talk about responsive, flexible services that meet the needs of the patients themselves and the service users, then it's really a quantum leap in terms of how we organise services. And if I can just give an example of what I mean. I used to, back in the day for a living, run telephone helplines and 24/7 on health-related issues. Around the National AIDS helpline, for example, for a while. We had a hell of a job staffing that 24/7. And as long as we tried to manage the staffing of that centrally in my organisation, by saying we have to have these shifts and a shift is so long and so on, we actually struggled massively. And one day we sort of had a light bulb moment and just got the staff together in one large group and says, we have to run this 24/7. Could you just take this off us, this scheduling business? And we ended up with some people working 3 hours a week, some people working from 2 o'clock until 5 o'clock in the morning, some people working a set number of hours a year, and they organised themselves into teams because some of them wanted to work at very weird times because it suited their lifestyle. Right. And we were able to... We actually stopped from that moment onwards having really big problems. We had different types of problems to deal with, and we had to... we didn't actually have to pay much more. People would work what we would call really antisocial hours because they were the hours they wanted to work, and they weren't
antisocial to them.
They weren't antisocial to them. They fitted into their lifestyle. Now, what does that mean in terms of this current debate? If I was to get together a group of parents and carers of people who were struggling with long-term conditions at home, they'd have very different desires and expectations about the hours that people came in to provide the services. 4:15, maximum of 4:15 minutes a day, which is in my area, I think you seem to get, that has to fit within the timetables of those people, just wouldn't cut it. You'd have to have something like the sort of approach we used in the helpline. You'd have to have a much more sort of people can put their bit into a pool of time, and then maybe we have to use technology to match up people against resources, something like that. But it's a very radical shift from fixed hours, fixed rates. Yeah. People, you know, it's a big deal to get into that. I mean, I agree with you. Yeah. I'm energized by the thoughts of doing stuff like that. But hell's teeth, it's going to be complicated.
And I think it's really important, and I've said it several times, that this is, we as we start this, we recognise it's hard. Otherwise, you come up against it and stop. One more, and then we'll move on to the next speaker.
So I'm just really interested in what the ladies from Trafford have said about, especially the last lady who spoke, sorry, can't remember your name, Diane, about it taking a group of committed individuals to make this happen. And the Institute runs used to run a course on leading large-scale change, and it was all focused really on kind of social movement aspect of it. And I suppose the issue for me then is, I think that's dead right, but then how do you make that happen at pace? Because you just said 7 years for children's services in Trafford. You're still not there with... Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. But you suppose still not there with adult services.
I think there's an important thing. It's interesting you mentioned 7 years because there's sort of a magic number that things may take 7 years, right? And certainly all across the country, that's the number people come up with. But if we started it 7 years ago, we'd have had it done, right? And so, in a sense, not starting is not, you know, if it takes 7 years, you might be able to do it in 5, but certainly this is a large-scale change.
I suppose. All right, that's reasonable. I think with the, I don't know, a lot of the rhetoric at the moment around the financial situation makes people feel that they're on a kind of burning platform. Yeah. And I do think that stymies the will to want to think about things 7 years hence.
I agree.
And people are thinking more about, let's integrate it a week on Tuesday.
Yeah.
And
I think what we need to do is, so there are, I know the finances of the National Health Service in 2015-16 are built upon the fact there'll be a 15% drop in emergency admissions. Now, that's sort of magic, right? It's magic thinking, as they say in South America. But if we concentrated on that, really on, and this is again, I was going to say this about committed, again, this group in Mid-Essex, it was a group of district nurses, because I kept on saying the problem is in Mrs. Jones' head, when she is breathless at 6 o'clock on Friday evening, the only safe place in the world is A&E. Now, we know it's a very unsafe place in her head. And I said to the district nurses, could you replace that in her head? And they said, yes, we could. Right? It would mean we'd change completely the way in which we work. But the commitment to changing that lack of safety in Mrs. Jones is what created a new service. Now, I think we could drop that we couldn't do 15%, but we could do probably 5% if we just spent a lot of time. We know who the people are. We know that we look at the patterns of entry into emergency admissions, and Mrs. Jones always goes in on a Friday. Fred always goes in on a Thursday. And we know what those patterns are. And if we surrounded them with care at those moments, we could probably diminish some of that. So this is a point to say that I don't think we can do the whole of... It takes a very small amount of investment, and you save an enormous amount of money in the second month, if it works. If it doesn't work, you don't save any money at all. But I think the point I was making is that I think to do all of this is a lifetime's work, because we spent a lifetime getting into the fragmented situation. But I think we need to chunk at various things, and the first one is going to have to be a money thing, which is why I pick on emergency admissions, right? So you know, and so all around the country, people are saying we probably need to do the frail elderly first. It's really hard. But actually, that's because of the finances.